LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 of our interview with Gary Lachman discussing his book Revolutionaries of the Soul, Reflections on Magicians, Philosophers and Occultists. The interview resumes as we continue to explore the life of Polish traveller, adventurer and popular author Jan Potocki. Hello and welcome Gary, and thanks so much for coming back on for part 2 of our chat today.
My pleasure, Greg. Thanks for having me on again.
Now, last time, as I say, we talked about your latest book, which is entitled Revolutionaries of the Soul, Reflections on Magicians, Philosophers and Occultists. We got through some of that, and today we're going to pick it up and explore some more of these characters. Just for people who've maybe dropped into this half and haven't heard the first bit, we're talking about characters such as Emanuel Swedenborg, Rudolf Steiner, Carl Jung, Helena Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Dion Fortune, just such a colourful cast of people who just had such interesting lives. I would suggest that the program page for this show will have the link back to part 1. So if people want the background to the book and to hear the first part, obviously just go there. What we did at the end of last week was we were just about to start talking about, is it Jan Potocki? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You got me. I think it is. I heard of Potocki, so I'm certainly can't speak Polish, so I don't know for sure.
Well, there was a couple of, we'll just say a little bit about him for people who don't know, because this guy, as I mentioned, was described as like a cross between Baron Munchausen meets Marco Polo, and also was the man who shot himself with a strawberry. And if people are not interested with those two headlines, then I don't know how they're going to get interested. But his masterpiece really was this Saragossa manuscript that you mentioned at the end of part 1. So just tell us a little bit about that, and obviously about his life, which sort of ended badly.
Potocki was this remarkable Polish polymath. He was a traveler, an ethnologist. He knew several languages, and he wrote this incredible sort of modern Arabian Nights, a book called The Manuscript Found in Saragossa, which itself has an incredible sort of publishing history, which I can't go into. It appeared in many different forms, and there's a tussle over whether he's actually Polish literary figure or a French one, because the original version of it came out in French and all this sort of thing. But he's one of these sort of early romantic enlightenment sort of occult kind of figures, kind of a crossover, where he was interested in the science, of the time. From him, mostly sort of anthropological, or what we would call sort of a cultural kind of ethnologist point of view. And he was also fascinated with the East, or the Near East, the Arab world. And he wrote this remarkable book, which is it's a sort of series of stories within stories within stories, kind of Chinese boxes sort of thing, or Russian doll kind of thing. And the main sort of plot is about a manuscript that's found in the Spanish town of Saragossa during the Napoleonic, not the Napoleonic Wars, but an earlier war. And the soldier who finds it reads it, and it's a tale of a soldier like himself who stumbles upon this incredible sort of cascade of weird adventures, starting with him falling asleep falling asleep in this inn, the Spanish inn, and being seduced by these two Arab sisters, and then waking up that morning actually finding himself below this gallows with dead, holding on to dead bodies, and so on and so on. So it has this. It's a classic of weird fiction, but it's also full of esoteric ideas and symbols. There's good reason to believe that Patazzi may have been involved in the Illuminati, and I mean the real Illuminati, not the the current Illuminati that's supposed to be controlling the world and run by politicians and rap artists. But I mean the very short-lived break-off group of Freemasonry started in the late 18th century. In Bavaria. He certainly was involved in Freemasonry. He was deeply interested in Rosicrucianism and Hermetic philosophy and Kabbalah, and all of that is in this remarkable story, this remarkable, incredible labyrinth of weird tales. But then Patazzi himself was, along with being this remarkable polymath and traveler and polyglot, and dabbler into esotericism and magic and the occult. He not late in life, but in sort of middle age, he developed this obsession that he had somehow become a werewolf in some way, that he had somehow been cursed with this. And he decided to kill himself. And the story is, and this is what I was told by a Polish playwright many years ago here in London, that he took sort of the top of a kind of sugar jar that was made of silver, and the sugar jar was shaped in the form of a strawberry, and then he melted this down and made silver bullets from it, and with one of those he blew his brains out. So I was told that he's the man known for shooting himself with a strawberry. So if that's not a fantastic story, I don't know what is.
Well, quite. I mean, I was going to say last week, I mean, these are gathered from articles and various things that you've written over a period of time in the past. And I'm wondering, how many other similar articles have you got knocking about or published? I guess the central question is, who did you have to leave out? How did you...
Well, the thing was... it was the publisher's, my friend Richard Smoley, the editor, his idea to do volumes solely kind of these little potted biographies. I have probably equal amount, not more articles of a more sort of general thematic. I have an article about a series of precognitive dreams I had many years ago. I have some other articles about, say, hypnagogia, which is this strange in-between state consciousness, in between sleeping and waking, that people like Jung and Steiner and Swedenborg and Ouspensky and many others explored, and so on and so on. So I have a collection of sort of thematic ones. But these I don't think there's too many sort of biographical ones left over. Actually, when I think about it, no, I can't think of any. I mean, since then, there's been some. Actually, there's one that I couldn't find the original of. Was a article I did for a magazine called The Wire here in London, not to be confused with Wired, which is sort of about electronic music. And I did an article about this early futurist musician, a fellow named Luigi Russolo, a weird Italian avant-garde artist, who was interested in the occult and was also a painter, but he's most known for developing these kind of musical instruments that, rather than making tones and so on, created weird noises. And this is supposed to be the early kind of form of creating art out of the new modern world, and so on and so on. And there may be one or two other kind of people in there that are in a box somewhere. But the remaining ones are mostly thematic sorts of ones. And at some point, I'd like to put those together as well.
You mentioned hypnagogia, that strange, as you say, state between wake and sleep. Have you read, you just remind me, I read a good book on it a few years ago, just called Hypnagogia by a guy called Andreas Mavromatis.
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, on my article, I write about his work a great deal, and it's also, his work, plays a central role in a book of mine called The Secret History of Consciousness, which is, kind of an overview of a variety of different, non-reductionist, non-scientistic, to be differentiated from scientific, sort of views of consciousness. And I relate some of his ideas about hypnagogia to people like, Rudolf Steiner, Yeah, no, it's a brilliant work. And I've met Andreas Mavromatis, a couple of years ago, here in London, and we, talked and had a conversation. And yes, no, it's a fantastic work. And, I first became sort of aware of it through, through personal experience. I went through a period of having sleep paralysis, which, at the time I thought was some weird thing that was happening to me, but when I did a bit of research, I subsequently found it was not too uncommon. This is when you sort of fall asleep, and then you wake up, you're conscious, but your body's paralyzed, your body's still asleep. And this is supposed to be, sort of the beginning of having an out-of-body experience, or so on and so on, other kind of strange, paranormal kind of phenomena. But it was through researching that I learned about hypnagogia, and then I read an interesting book called The Natural Depth in Man by a Californian psychologist named Wilson Van Dusen, who also wrote a very good book, a good introductory book about Swedenborg. Swedenborg was someone who was able to spend very, very long periods of time in this hypnagogic state. What happens there, you have these kind of waking dreams, where you have sort of, you're not completely in a dream, let's say, and it's different from a lucid dream. A lucid dream, you could say, is you're waking while dreaming, and hypnagogia, you can say you're dreaming while waking, in the sense that you're aware of your surroundings and aware of yourself, but you also can see these sort of, some people see them very vividly, hallucinations, so let's say images. So they could be faces, they could be landscapes, could be kind of jewels or a kind of filigree design. You also hear voices. I still often have auditory sort of hypnagogia as I'm falling asleep, and you hear a voice say something to you, or call your name or something like that. And what Van Dusen discovered was rather than these sorts of things just being random, kind of noise given off by the brain as you're falling asleep, they actually had a symbolic character. And he developed an idea that a colleague of Jung's and Freud's named Herbert Silberberg developed. Silberberg wrote about hypnagogia in the early 1910s. And Jung knew of his work, and I think it's clear that Jung developed his own particular technique of hypnagogia, what he called active imagination. I think based, to some degree on Silberberg's conclusions about it, his analysis of it. And what I was going to say is that his sort of central idea is that these things are auto-symbolic. The images you see or the voices you hear, what they say, aren't just random. They're somehow symbolic of you, of your state at the time, either your physical state or mental or psychological, and so on and so on. And so I just became fascinated with that and experimented with it, basically trying to enter the state. And one thing I learned for certain that it's much better to do it early in the morning than late at night as you're falling asleep, because I usually, entered insomnia trying to stay awake to, be aware of the images. So I found it much more congenial to, try to wake up a bit earlier.
Yes.
And slowly rise out of it. That's some researchers split hairs and call that hypnopompic rather than hypnagogic. Hypnagogic is leading down, leading into, and hypnopompic is leading out of. But it's basically the same sort of thing.
Yeah, well, we could talk about that all day, actually, but I'm going to have to move on. We can come back to it in the future.
No, absolutely.
The next of your cast of characters, anybody who's not deeply into the occult, perhaps, but who's browsed occult sections in second-hand bookshops, is this character called LFS Levi. Again, not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's not his real name, but I came across him in just such a situation back in the 80s, second-hand bookshop, little occult section, and it was this Transcendental Magic book, 1986, translated by this guy called E.A. Waite. Now, in reading your article, perhaps that was not the best source for me to have first discovered this guy's writing.
Oh, well, yeah, well, that's who everybody discovered him through, though. I'm with you. It was 70s for me, late 70s into early 80s, discovering him. And I first learned about him through reading Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, and then through just getting into books on magic, books about Crowley and the Golden Dawn and so on. Yeah, he's one of these eccentric characters in the 19th century, which they don't seem to make anymore. But his real name was Alphonse Louis Constant, and he had rather a checkered career. He was a defrocked priest, or he was on the way. He was on the way to becoming, taking the vows in the cloth, and he discovered that he couldn't give up sex, basically. And but he also was an artist. He illustrated books at the time in magazines and periodicals and things of that sort. And just a side note about that, if you know this well copied and disseminated image of this idol Baphomet, who is supposed to be one of the idols that the Knights Templar worshipped, and is often equated with Satan and the devil, and it's this goat-like figure with the upside-down pentagram and so on. That original drawing of that is Levy's, but he never gets credit for it. No, and then he was this wild, flamboyant socialist and early feminist, actually. And this is in Paris in the 1850s, which was a time of revolution and social unrest and so on and so on. And what had happened is that he came into contact with this strange Polish, another eccentric named Honorowski, that's his last name, who was a kind of scientist, mathematician, and astronomer, but he developed this, what he called the system of universal knowledge, that he called messianism. And it's had something to do with number, and in the Pythagorean sense of number, a kind of number mysticism, and also Hermeticism and the Kabbalah and a variety of other things. And Constant became kind of a devotee of Honorowski's ideas, while at the same time his wife, this young woman who was much younger than he was, practically in her teens, started an affair with the editor of one of the radical periodicals that Constant wrote for. And so while his wife was basically, while he was being cuckolded, he was learning about the Kabbalah and so on. And then when it came out that his wife was leaving him for the editor, he had a kind of crisis and transformed himself, reinvented himself, and changed his name to LFS Levi. That's how I pronounce it, or LFS Levi, I guess, if you're trying to sound French, and which he said was a Hebrew transliteration of his own name. And he presented himself as this modern, at the time, magician and Kabbalist. And he wrote these fantastically readable, but often highly unreliable, very romantic books about magic. Transcendental Magic is one of them, and there's another one, The History of Magic. And he made all these portentous claims about Kabbalah and so on, but he didn't know Hebrew at all. And so later Kabbalists, people like Gershom Scholem, who was very dry, scholarly expert on Jewish mysticism in the 20th century, just said, these books are kind of rubbish. He's just making it all up. But in one sense, you could look at it from a chaos theory, point of view, or even a kind of postmodern magic point of view. It doesn't really matter to some degree because they're exciting. And what's really the key to Levy's work is that he's one of the ones to pick up on the whole romantic idea that was gripped Europe at the time, and the power of the imagination and the will. And he brings together kind of Mesmer's idea of this animal magnetism, this kind of invisible fluid force that permeates the universe and which is, part of us as well, and which we can learn to sort of master, with ideas of the power of the will, hypnotism, and so on. And he takes on the romantic idea of the artist as a kind of magician, and the secrets of magic being imagination and the will, rather than a kind of meticulous exactitude about all of the preparations and the magical circle and so on and so on. It becomes much more a kind of focus of the magician's own kind of force of will and imagination. And he was very influential. People like Baudelaire, people like Rimbaud, later French artists and cultural figures like Odeon Redon, the painter, Eric Satie, Debussy. They were influenced by his ideas. And he is also part of a long tradition of a kind of, in France, of a kind of Catholic occultism, this strange kind of meeting between this occult tradition and Roman Catholicism. It's kind of esoteric sort of Christianity that Levi kind of finds himself a part of.
Well, next in the hot seat is Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, more commonly just known as Madame Blavatsky. And I first came across her name when I was reading about Rudolf Steiner, and there's a connection there with the Theosophical Society and the sort of developments that flowed from all that.
Yes, you mentioned a connection between Rudolf Steiner and Theosophy, Theosophical Society, and Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky was, of course, one of the co-founders of the Theosophical Society in New York City, of all places, on the East Side in 1875. Steiner became one of Europe's most important Theosophists in the early 20th century. This was several years after Blavatsky died. She died in 1891, and then he later broke with it around 1912 over Krishnamurti, and I'll just say briefly now, Krishnamurti, who became a well-known guru and teacher in the 60s, 70s, and he lived into the 80s. He started out being discovered in India by C.W. Leadbeater, who was leading Theosophists at the time. And basically, he was believed to be sort of this avatar of this coming new age. And he was touted as a kind of God-man, kind of modern Christ to some degree. And Steiner wouldn't have any of it. So he broke off and started his own group called the Anthroposophical Society. And you can see a difference there with Theosophical is the wisdom of the gods, and Anthroposophical is the wisdom of man. And although Steiner practically took, basically he took the scaffolding of Theosophy and introduced elements of, again, a kind of Christian esotericism, but also a good helping of German idealist philosophy. Steiner was a remarkable figure. He's another remarkable polymath. I think I talked about him last time. He's known for embarrassingly number of things that he could do, like architecture and health and agriculture. But he was also a philosopher, and he was also a kind of scholar. And he introduced elements of sort of Kant and Hegel and a variety of other, and Nietzsche, German philosophies into theosophical kind of system. But the system itself originated with this remarkable woman, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who was this madcap, just kind of wild Russian woman who was born in 1831, and she came from a noble family. Her grandmother was the daughter of a princess, and there was on her father's side. Her father was a Baltic German Russian who also came from sort of had nobility in his background. But she was a kind of live wire, and at an early age, she was obsessed with sort of knowing the mysteries, and she discovered her great-grandfather's library, and he had been a Freemason in the 18th century, and he had this fantastic occult and Rosicrucian and Masonic library, and there she learned about this idea of these hidden masters, these kind of secret leaders, hidden superiors, as it's called in certain branches of Freemasonry. And then she also met a fellow named Prince Golitsyn, who talked to her of his travels. And he was one of these characters who at the time the title was kind of noble traveler, someone who traveled in search of knowledge, and he literally went on a kind of search for the miraculous, and he went to Egypt and to the East, and so on, meeting different people and learning different traditions and sharing knowledge and so on. And she became, obsessed with this idea. And pretty soon after entering into this not necessarily disastrous, but again, very short-lived marriage. I think she was only 17, and she was married off to a fellow who was considered ancient at the time, but he was only 42 then. But back then, that was quite old. And the marriage was unconsummated, and after a few months of frustration and a sort of disastrous honeymoon, she headed off on her own, and then she went on these remarkable world travels. I mean, according to her, there isn't a great deal of independent corroboration for much of what she says, but there seems to be enough to suggest that, at least some of the things she said she did, and some of the places she said she went to, she actually did. And this included, most famously, Tibet, where she claimed to have gone on tried to get to on 3 different occasions, and only reached it on the 3rd. And this was because she was compelled to go there by this Hindu teacher that at different times in her career she described in different ways, and also provided him with a slightly differing kind of chronology and backstory. This could be someone who came to her in her dreams when she was quite young, or someone that she met either in Hyde Park or on the bridge over the Thames in London, and who prevented her from committing suicide, and so on and so on. But in any case, this was one of the masters from whom she later claimed that she had learned occult secrets and spent much time with in a secret monastery in Tibet, and where she was also given a mission to bring the truth, occult truth, to the West, to basically try to slow down the growth of Western materialism. And I mean, you could do a whole talk about her, but after 2 decades of traveling around the world, Egypt, all over Europe, North and South America, India, as I said, Tibet, Central Asia, so on and so on. She turns up in New York in 1873, I think at about the age of 43. And this is where we first begin to have some kind of, external corroboration about her activities. And she very quickly seduces, not in a sexual way, but in a intellectual or spiritual way, this another remarkable fellow, 19th century character, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, who sadly is usually depicted as a kind of dupe of Blavatsky's. But he was a remarkable fellow. Aside from the many things he did, he was part of the commission that investigated Abraham Lincoln's assassination. He was a world-renowned agriculturalist. He was a journalist, and so on and so on. But he was bowled over by Blavatsky. He was very interested in spiritualism, which was very popular in the United States at the time, and he was investigating a sort of haunting at a farmhouse in Connecticut and writing about it for a newspaper. Blavatsky read the stories, and she went there with the express purpose of meeting Olcott and basically, getting him on her team. And she succeeded in that. And then, as they say, the rest was history. After that, he basically helped promote her, and they went through a few different kind of incarnations, as it were, before they hit on the idea of the Theosophical Society, which became probably the most important occult, metaphysical, esoteric, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, organization of modern time, because practically all modern esotericism comes out of it. As I said, Steiner, but also people like Yeats, Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, Schwalbe-Lubitsch, and so on and so on. And it also affected the arts. Kandinsky, the painter, was a theosophist, and his ideas about art and aesthetic theory were soaked in theosophical ideas. So, I mean, what can you say? She's one of these figures who's probably just as as important in creating the modern age as Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. But probably because of her. I mean, the thing with Blavatsky is that she was supposedly found out to have been a fraud, but that whole story itself is very doubtful.
You mentioned Rudolf Steiner last time and again this week in the context that we've just been discussing. And again, he's a character that we could do an entire show on. But one thing I just wanted to throw in, just to get your thoughts on, were the aforementioned Steiner Schools, perhaps better known as the Waldorf Schools, first of which was established, I believe, in 1919. And these are now worldwide. There's one in the city here where I live. I've been to it because a few years ago, an associate of mine, an artist, was conducting some workshops there for the children. And he just had to go there at the weekend to pick up some equipment. And it was interesting just to walk around the place when there was no one there. But a lot of people will be thinking, if they know about Steiner Schools at all, they'll be thinking, oh, perhaps they're controversial. People seem to have quite strong feelings about it. And there's websites out there, one called Steiner Watch or whatever, and they're treating the Waldorf Schools like it's some sort of cult. So I don't know, in your research and readings and just your personal opinion, what your take on that those establishments is.
Well, I mean, I had some contact with the Steiner School. In fact, my two sons, when they were very young, they went to a Steiner School here in London, from I guess kindergarten up until, I don't know, probably they were about 8 or 9 or something like that. And then we just decided to take them out and put them into the regular system. But I mean, I think, I know what you mean about these websites. I've seen them. In fact, my name has come up on some of them. On some people say, "Oh, watch out for him." He presents himself as kind of objective and disinterested, but he's really blah blah blah. But I mean, I don't know. I think Steiner's ideas are fundamentally good. I think they've had some remarkable success, both in the regular schools and in the schools for special needs schools. But I guess the schools themselves are different, depending on who the people are there and so on. I mean, I've defended it in print. I mean, I did a short article about the Steiner Schools for the Times educational supplement here in London. I think fundamentally it's a good thing. I do think there is always a danger of something being kind of adhered to dogmatically, ideologically, rather than say more creative, open kind of common sense sort of thing. So I don't know. In a general way, I believe they're good, but I can see where in individual cases there might be problems.
Yeah, well, I very much agree with your take. It's a case of, as you say, there were certain ideas that he came up with that were never intended to be taken as some sort of, quasi-religion, but they were they were ideas that to some people seemed strange. And, even today, they strike people as odd, but it was just a different way of looking at things. But yeah, it's down to, common sense adaptation of these things going forward.
I mean, one of the things that I found it difficult to go along with, although theoretically I understand why Steiner said it, was this notion about not teaching reading until I think it was the age of 7, and it was related to sort of loss of the first teeth, something like that. And you could say that in itself is something completely wacky. And what has that got to do with anything? I didn't have a problem with Steiner's ideas about that, and I'm not going to go into what they were. But to me, I felt that if a child showed a real interest, in it and wanted to kind of inhibit that, I felt, to me would have been counterproductive. And the reason I felt that's because I was an early reader myself. And so there was a difference of opinion. And in fact, one of the reasons why we did take, our sons out was that, one of them, the class he was in, they kept losing their teacher. And the new teacher would come in and kind of start from day one. And, he really didn't get, introduction to reading until quite, even late, in the Steiner system. And that was something that we were concerned about. So, but again, I think it's a sort of thing that I agree with you. I mean, I think this is one of the problems with a lot of these alternative thinkers, or where you have the original ideas hot off the presses, as it were, living and vital, and then they become a system, or there's a danger of them becoming a system. And this tends to be true not only of Steiner, but I think of pretty much everybody. I mean, I've encountered that in different ways with all the different people I've written about, Swedenborg, Jungians, Crowleyans, and so on and so on. And there's always this possibility, and I think Steiner himself, even though he was very happy that the practical aspects of his work were being so successful as they were, towards the end of his life, he died in 1925, he did feel like the initial sorts of ideas, the more philosophical ideas about consciousness, more strictly esoteric ideas, let's say, which for Steiner were epistemological, really, had to do with our consciousness's relation to the outer world and so on, were being obscured by the kind of practical kind of achievements that had grown out of them. So not to diminish those in any way, but they kind of took on a life of their own in some ways. But this is something that always happens, and that's why I've after we say checking out real hands-on, getting involved and joining in with two of these things, systems, let's say. After doing that for a few years, I decided, well, actually, it's I didn't want to lock myself into any particular kind of teaching and way of life, because it becomes a way of life as well. That's another thing too. I think there's a difference between people like myself who are interested in a lot of these ideas because they're ideas, because they throw light on mysteries of existence, and anything that does that, I'm welcome to, rather than a way of life, a kind of whole kind of way of being in the world that you adopt. Which is kind of what a religion is to some degree. So I have a more philosophical approach to it than, let's say, a religious or even spiritual one.
Well, perhaps we should say a little something about this character Manly P. Hall, or otherwise Manly Palmer Hall. Now, this is a name I'd seen all over the place, but knew almost nothing about. There'd just be a reference here and a reference there, someone else saying that they were influenced by his speaking or his writing or whatever. Now, this is you can pick up the story, but it's quite the list of devotees and followers, if you want to use that word.
Yeah, I mean, Manly Hall, he, in the early 20th century, say up until like the 50s, although he was still active, even until the 80s and 90s, early 90s at least, perhaps late 80s when he died. He was very influential, very well known. He was a very popular, he wasn't really a guru, but he was sort of a learned spiritual teacher, philosopher. He's most famous for putting together this remarkable book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages, that he compiled when he was in his early 20s. He came out in 1928, and it's this remarkable encyclopedia of esoteric, hermetic, Kabbalistic, Gnostic, Masonic, Neoplatonic teachings, philosophies, and symbols, and it's also has these remarkable illustrations, these paintings depicting various things discussed. So, say, the Tree of Life, or sort of the Hermetic scheme of the heavens, or kind of the creation of the world according to Gnostics, and so on and so on. For years, he lectured in Los Angeles at this remarkable place. It was called the Philosophical Research Society, and the building in the Los Feliz area of Hollywood, just sort of at the beginning of sort of the Hollywood Hills, is this incredible kind of Mayan deco structure, And within it, there was this fantastic lecture hall and sort of meditation rooms and things of that sort. But he also had one of the most incredible hermetic libraries. It's a fantastic library, and I used to use it. And in the sort of late 70s, I lived in Los Angeles. I used to go see him speak. He used to give Sunday morning lectures on, just about everything. He just would talk. He would, he just was this kind of font of knowledge and very learned. But he had this, background in sort of the old Hollywood. So people like Bela Lugosi, Gloria Swanson, Cecil B. DeMille, Samuel Goldwyn, they were friends of his. And he gave lectures in old Hollywood, say in the 20s and the 30s and 40s. And a lot of people think, the whole kind of esoteric or occult or magical or mystical kind of revival started in the late 60s. But certainly in California, it had been around for a long time. I mean, even going back to the turn of the century, when the Theosophists came out to California, a woman named Catherine Tingley, and started a sort of theosophical commune down in San Diego, an area called Point Loma. But in the 20s and 30s in Hollywood, there, it had its own swamis and gurus, and also health food fanatics and sort of nature cure people and psychics and mystical teachers, and as you know later on, people like Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, and others, Krishnamurti, who I mentioned earlier, were all part of this Hollywood scene, and Manly Palmer Hall was one of these people, and sadly, he had this very strange end, where he was he seemed to be kind of come under the control of this fellow Dr. Fritz, who was a kind of alternative health guru, and Hall was increasingly obese. He didn't, care about his health very much. He was a sugar addict, and so on and so on. And his wife was a bit, should we say, unstable. She had this obsession with this sort of buried Rosicrucian, sort of secret treasures in these different American historical sites, and she petitioned the government relentlessly to get funding to unearth some of these things, and on at least one occasion they did fund something and they didn't find anything. But in any case, both of them came under this fellow's sort of control, and he more or less sort of took over and swindled them out of much of their own personal sort of money, but also over sort of legal control of the Philosophical Research Society and the library and all this sort of thing. And the story is that this fellow Fritz, who's dead now, so I can't be sued for saying this, but there's a wonderful biography about Hall that came out a few years ago, whose author's name escapes me right now. But he tells the story, and it reads like a Raymond Chandler, sort of, L.A. Philip Marlowe kind of crime novel, where this fellow Fritz, after getting Hall to sign over to him, surreptitiously control over his assets and so on and so on, he drove him out to the desert on some kind of, sort of bogus reason. There's no reason for him to go out there, and more or less kind of exposed him to the elements when he was very old, elderly, frail, not well, so on and so on, and basically allowed him to die, and then somehow arranged for it to appear that it happened through natural causes and so on. And the weird thing that happened that tipped coroner off is apparently while they were doing checking out the body, they noticed all these ants coming out of Hall's body. This is really weird. This is like something for the X-Files. Out of his orifices, as they say in the story. And they had somehow crawled into him while he was lying out in the desert. And this led to an investigation and so on. And in the end, I think the parties involved died, so there was no kind of final conclusion to the story. But it is this kind of very, very weird, as I say, kind of Philip Marlowe kind of murder mystery. But if you ever get a chance, The Secret Teachings of All Ages is a must. It's one of these remarkable browsing books. I mean, I don't know too many people who've read it cover to cover. But it's one of the, and the other thing too is it's huge. It's my publisher Torture Penguin put out a kind of reader-friendly edition a few years back, which it's just the text and it doesn't have the illustrations. But if you get one of the original editions, it's big. It's kind of like a big kind of record book. That should be on a sort of pedestal, and you have to open it with two hands and that kind of thing, and write in a quill pen in it. But it has, it's just the sort of thing where you would love to browse through. And again, like LFS Levi, Hall isn't always, by today's standards, as accurate as he should be. But he writes well, and it's interesting. It's one of those books that someone like Borges, would have loved. You can just open it up and there's some erudite, knowledge about some eccentric, weird thing that you wouldn't know otherwise.
Yeah, well, certainly Manly Hall's his life and, as you say, bizarre death was one of the more interesting chapters in the book. We turn to someone in the UK now, this lady called Dion Fortune, who, I hadn't heard this. I thought, Dion Fortune, where have I seen that? What is that? And I was never able to figure it out. And actually, when I read about her in your book, I thought, oh, well, it's nothing like I thought it was. But start off perhaps by telling us a little bit about how she came to adopt this moniker and about the psychic attacks or stroke defense against the Nazis during the war. Because that in itself, you're just thinking, oh my God, there must be a film script here somewhere.
Dion Fortune was a name taken by Violet Firth, who was born in Wales, late 19th century, 1890, and she had this strange experience at a kind of women's college she went to, where she got into a kind of psychic tussle with the headmistress, who she felt was kind of she was a sort of domineering, controlling kind of character, who supposedly had learned this sort of power of controlling the people and developing her will, like mentioned earlier. When she was in sort of Central Asia, she had spent some time in Afghanistan, as one did back then. Violet tried to help a fellow student of hers who this headmistress was domineering. And then when the headmistress found out about it, she came after her. And they had this kind of psychic battle of wills. And in the end, Violet had caved in. And what it was is somehow the headmistress made her admit that she had no self-esteem and that she was this weak-willed measly kind of creature who should had no right to raise any problems whatsoever, and so on and so on. And this experience led her to want to understand her own psychology and basically to kind of overcome this passivity that she had. She felt that she had lost her own will, she had lost her own self in this confrontation. And she started studying psychology. And she was one of the early people in the UK reading Freud. But at the university where she was taking classes in psychology, there was a branch of the Theosophical Society nearby. And just out of curiosity, she went in and checked it out. But she decided to try one of the kind of sort of meditation techniques that is being talked about in a lecture that she attended to, just as a lark, basically, just to pass the time. And strangely enough, she had this very positive reaction to it, and she had a kind of hypnagogic vision of a past life in Atlantis, of all places. And she started to become more and more interested in theosophy, and she basically joined the Theosophical Society. But she didn't completely reject or dismiss her earlier psychological roots, and she's often seen as someone who tried to bring together psychoanalysis and the occult in a way different than, let's say, the way that Jung did with his work. She became more and more interested in a variety of different occult and magical sorts of activities, and she finally drifted into joining a kind of branch or an offshoot or a fragment of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was one of the most, if not the most, influential sort of occult secret society of the late 19th century. But the Theosophical Society wasn't secret; it was out in the open. It was kind of publicly advertised. Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn kept a bit more of a lower profile, and earlier members of it, its heyday was in the 1890s. This was about the late 19-teens when Violet would have got involved. People like W.B. Yeats, the poet, Nobel Prize winner, who was also a magician and a theosophist, and also Aleister Crowley, another very, very famous or infamous member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It was precisely Crowley's kind of sort of breaking into the Golden Dawn, as it were, party breaking, that led to its kind of fracture. But Violet got involved with a group that was led by Moyna Mathers, who was the widow of MacGregor Mathers, who's another one of these wild, eccentric characters, should be in this book, who was one of the leaders of the Golden Dawn, was the leader at the time of its fracture. And he had died at the end of the First World War. And Moyna was psychic. She was also sister of the French philosopher Henri Bergson. And when Violet first joined this branch of the Golden Dawn, when you initiated, you took a new name, and she took as her sort of magical motto in Latin, Deo non fortuna, which is by God, not luck. And her magical name became Dion Fortune, and this was also sort of a family motto. So it was a kind of strangely, she's taking on the same name, but this name related to her previous identity as well. And then, just as with her tussle with the headmistress, Dion Fortune got into a kind of psychic battle with Moyna Mathers as well. And there's this, famous, story of them sort of battling out on the astral plane and sending sort of etheric cats, at each other and things of that sort. And then the story goes, so sort of Moyna won the first round, but then Dion got back in the ring, as it were, and triumphed in the end. And then subsequent to this, she started writing these very readable and psychologically astute books about magic. Probably the most well-known, a couple of the most well-known ones is she did this interesting book called Psychic Self-Defense, which was tells the story of these sort of psychic tussles that she had with the headmistress and later, and tells her story about how she developed her powers and so on. And then she also wrote about the Kabbalah. She wrote about sort of sex in a very muted kind of early 20th century way, but also talking about the esoteric philosophy of love and marriage, and so on and so on. And she also wrote novels. I was going to say probably her most famous book is Mystical Kabbalah, which is a very clearly written kind of synthesis of Kabbalistic ideas of people like LFS Levi and Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn into a more or less a comprehensive sort of system. But she also wrote novels. She wrote a series of magical novels that probably could, a smart publisher could probably put these out again, and they might stand a chance of becoming very popular. But you mentioned this kind of magical defense that she was engaged in during the Blitz, and yes, during the height of the Battle of Britain, she gathered several people, and they met in an area of London called Bayswater, which is near Hyde Park, and they started to do this kind of group meditation, and sending these kind of psychic forces against the Nazis, and reaching out to sort of places like Norway, sending these angelic sort of presences out to the North Sea. And she wasn't the only one doing it at the time. It's a famous story, which is probably apocryphal, about Gerald Gardner, who was kind of the inventor of modern Wicca, modern witchcraft. She popularized in the 50s, but he tells the story of going out into one of the forests here with Churchill, of all people, and engaging in some kind of Wiccan magical rites in order to repel Jerry. So they were very patriotic, and in a way she was a very patriotic occultist. I mean, in a way she was a kind of mystical nationalist, because she wrote about the spirit of Avalon, and she wrote about places like Glastonbury, which everybody knows what Glastonbury is now, but it wasn't as well known back in the day, and she lived there for a long time. Like Blavatsky and Annie Besant, she's one of these very important female figures in the history of Western esotericism.
I had an interesting little moment, I don't know if you would call it a synchronicity or not, when I read about Dion Fortune, that I remembered that the cutlery I have is very old. So I just had a quick look at one of the forks, and it said on the back, stamped into it, was Firth, Sheffield.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's her background.
Yeah, so
how strange. Well, of course it's a synchronicity.
Yeah.
she's thanking you for being interested in her, I guess.
Now, as we're drawing to the end of the session today, Gary, we're skipping over people, and we're skipping over luminaries such as Jung, Crowley. So, obviously there's loads more to delve into for readers. We're even skipping over a not a well-known figure at all, but one of the chapters I enjoyed most, because I never heard of this guy called James Webb. But right. I wanted to talk about, again, another guy I wasn't familiar with until now, Owen Barfield, partly because you had a chance to go and meet him and interview him. Again, he's sort of, based in the UK. So I thought that would just be somewhere that it would be a nice point to end on, I think.
Yes. I had the very good fortune of conducting what I believe is the last interview with Owen Barfield. I think he was 97 at the time, and I think this was late 1996. And Barfield isn't that well known. He should be much better known than he is. Fans of C.S. Lewis know of him, because he was the great friend of C.S. Lewis, and they engaged in what they call the Great War. It's kind of ongoing debate, argument they had over their different views of life and so on. And he was one of the group that met in Oxford called the Inklings, which included C.S. Lewis and also Tolkien and Charles Williams, who's another writer and esoteric or spiritual, also occult kind of thinker. He's not as well known. He wrote a series of interesting kind of occult novels in the 30s that are kind of thrillers that deal with esoteric ideas and so on. But Barfield started out. Just a side note with that, he actually wrote, I think called The Silver Trumpet. He wrote a fantasy novel, I think, even before Lewis and Tolkien, but it's not that well known. But Barfield, he sort of, he's kind of a literary critic, literary philosopher, and he wrote an early book, his first book is called History in English Words, where he had this notion that you could trace what he called the evolution of consciousness through the history of language. Make a long story short, his theory was that at an earlier time, language seems to suggest that the history of language seems to suggest that our consciousness was different. That the consciousness of, say, someone in the Middle Ages, or even earlier than that, was very different than our modern consciousness. And this isn't the same thing as saying they had different ideas, but the actual way they perceived and interacted with the world was different. And then Barfield discovered that Rudolf Steiner had a similar idea, but that Steiner had developed it into this huge kind of system. And Barfield became not so much a follower, but he was very interested in Steiner's work. He wrote a great deal about it. I don't believe he met him. I think Steiner had died before Barfield became involved. But he wrote a few books in his early years, and then basically realized he couldn't make a living as a writer, and so he went to his family's law firm, and then for many years that's what he was, and he continued to write, and he wrote these very interesting books about language, about poetry, books about philosophy at the time, and then he wrote a series of articles about anthroposophy, about Steiner's ideas, and relating it to ideas about poetry and language and consciousness and people like Goethe and people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and others. And it wasn't until his 60s that he was kind of rediscovered. And for a while in the late 50s, early 60s, his books are very popular in kind of religious studies and theological studies, and he was invited to give lots of lectures at different universities and so on, and then his books came back into print and so on. And people like the novelist Saul Bellow spoke highly of him, was very interested in him. And I became interested in him both because I'm interested in language, I'm interested in evolution of consciousness, and because he wrote very clearly about Steiner and put Steiner into a context that where it made sense for me. Because I have to admit, a lot of the things Steiner says are quite strange and eccentric. And Barfield was able to put the central ideas into a context that where they made sense to me in Western philosophy, literature, and so on. And when I first moved to London in beginning of 1996, I used to frequent a bookshop in sort of Bloomsbury. It was a sort of Steiner bookshop, and I saw his work there, and I bought a few books, and the proprietor told me that that he knew him, that so on, and very interesting, you're interested in his work, and so on. And then basically, through knowing this fellow, I was able to go to visit Barfield, where he lived in East Grinstead, which in itself is an interesting area because it's kind of an area known for different alternative schools there. There's Emerson College is there, which is a sort of Steiner anthroposophical adult educational center. There's also, I think, a big Scientology center out there as well. In any case, Barfield was living there. He was very, as I said, 97, so quite old, but remarkably alert and remarkably aware. And I had, as I said, the great opportunity to spend about an hour with him talking and so on. And I wrote the article in here. Then I did a similar one for another journal as well, and then used the material in my book Secret History of Consciousness. But no, he's a brilliant writer, and he's a very good writer. I always like meeting coming across people in this area who can actually write well, because that's one of the things that often isn't the case. You have brilliant thinkers and they have remarkable ideas, but they're not always expressed very, very clearly. And Barfield is someone I always enjoy reading him. He has a very, very clean, very eloquent and elegant sort of style. And he also has, this background in Western literature that, as I said, is very congenial to me.
Well, one of the most fascinating ideas in all of that for me is this notion that, the world is a result of our perceptions and that our ancestors thought and therefore actually saw the world differently. But was the world different as a result? And it got me thinking about, well, what happens when we go back farther and farther in time? I'm sure a lot has been written about this, and I've read some of around these ideas, but it's just relentlessly fascinating because we tend to assume that if we take Darwinian evolution at face value, that at some point modern humans, quote unquote, had developed, and they're no matter how far back you go, once that was established, well, they're basically the same as us, just with different clothes or something like that,
Yeah, no. He really differentiates between what he calls an evolution of consciousness and a history of ideas. He has this notion of what he calls participation, and basically this means that at an earlier time, an earlier age, you would say certainly in prehistory, and then depending on where you want to sort of mark where the change occurs. In my books, I give a couple different sort of possibilities, but more or less the idea that as an earlier time, the kind of strict separation between our inner and outer worlds wasn't quite as firm. The boundaries were more permeable, were more porous, and even at a very earlier time, the whole Marcy would say, there wasn't a strict notion of a separate I, an I and ego separate from the world around it. Somehow, the outer and inner participated. It's a flow kind of between them. But in the evolution of consciousness, according to him, and also according to Steiner and other people that I talk about in the book and elsewhere, there was this push out of this kind of early warm kind of embrace, this sort of at one with the world. And again, we use notions like world and nature, but these are all ideas that came later. Barfield says in one of his, to me, kind of most gnomic, meaning, dense and difficult kind of statement is that, asking about the origin of language is like asking about the origin of origin. Because, as you said, the standard notion is that there's a world out there. It's just been like that. And at some point, human beings kind of, clicked. Our brains clicked and we became aware of this world that was already there, just as it is now, and so on and so on. Barfield's suggesting a different kind of view in the sense that at an earlier time, there wasn't a world and a you perceiving it. There wasn't this duality. There wasn't this polarity. And you don't get a world until you get to development of language. World, language, and self kind of all are kind of a package deal. They all come into existence around the same time. Basically saying you can't have one without the other. And so it wasn't as if, yes, we were all kind of hanging out and, basically not having language for a long time, and then we suddenly just, invented language, and then used it to sort of map this world that we'd already been looking at for a long time, but just didn't have any words to name it. He's saying, no, there wouldn't have been a sense of a separate world. There wouldn't have been a you looking at, observing this world that's detached from you until you had the development of language. These are all deep, difficult, dark sort of thoughts, but Barfield's very clear and eloquent about it. But the upshot of this, he's saying, is that, well, he can trace through language different kind of stages of what he calls participation. So at a very early time, participation is almost total. There isn't a real sense of separateness between the inner world and the outer. It's all kind of one. And even in our own development, we can see this. I know children. It's not until around the age of 2 that they start to have a sense of themselves being separate from the world around them. And this is why it's the terrible twos. The first thing they learn to say is no. separates themselves from the thing around them. Up until then, they didn't, they didn't have this. And so Barfield is saying something like that is similar in the history of humanity as well. And then gradually, there's an increasing kind of separation, an increasing participation is less and less, until, with, again, depending where you want to place the marker. But let's say around 500-600 BC, at the beginning of what the German philosopher Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age. And it's around the same time as you get the beginning of the first religions, or the beginning of kind of Greek philosophy, not the mythical kind of thought before, which was narrative based on a story. You get actually, people thinking like, what is this made of? What is this all about? Asking questions in this kind of analytical way. You could say at that point, this kind of the participation is we're not participating anymore. We're not consciously participating in the world around us. It's something that's completely separate. And our consciousness has been like that in varying degrees over, our history. But he did feel there were indications of a movement towards what he called final participation. So you have original participation, then this kind of middle period of a kind of separation, leading to a sort of alienation, which is what we experience now in our postmodern time, to what he would call this final participation, which is a kind of rediscovery of this connection, of this relatedness, to the outer world, but without losing the kind of independent ego that we have now. I mean, we can plunge back into this participation, various different means, through meditation, let's say, or more direct means through taking various kinds of drugs. But what we gain through the ease of access, through that we lose in our independence. We basically give up the ego in order to plunge back into this kind of connectedness. And what he and people like Steiner and also other philosophers I talk about in the book are trying to get across is this notion of basically trying to keep what we've won, the hard-earned independence of the ego, while regaining this connection. Not going back into an earlier kind of form of consciousness, but pushing ahead into this other kind of union of the two. And no, but I mean, this is what I do in my book, A Secret History of Consciousness, where I talk about Barfield and Steiner's and Jean Gebser, who I talk about in the book, but we haven't had a chance to talk about. Schwaller de Lubitsch, who I don't talk about in this book, but I do talk about in some others. What I find interesting is they all in different ways have a very similar kind of view. And that suggests to me, and also some contemporary neuroscientists and philosophers of mind say something similar too. So that suggests to me there's something there.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and it's very exciting, to be honest, even though it's opaque. I really don't know what's going to happen. One final thought, just in general for this time, and reading about all these people and their lives, and the good, the bad, the indifferent, the amazing, the wonderful, the tragic, all these things that happen to them that they do, and the people and places around them. Who are their peers today? I mean, is the world we live in, is it too small? Is it too interconnected? Is it too bland for people like this?
Well, I don't know. It's always, when you look into the past, it always has a certain kind of glow of, a kind of aura of significance that the present in many ways, seems to lack. So I don't know. I guess I'm a kind of historian, although I hesitate to, make a claim, officially to that kind of title, because I don't want any academics to be offended, at it. But, my head is kind of turned back. I'm trying to understand, the cultural influences and ideas that led up to today. But, to me, I think there's important work going on now, but I don't know about, the kind of flamboyant figures like this. I guess there's plenty of gurus going on, but in a way, I think the whole esoteric sort of tradition and theme, I think since the 60s and the 70s, and certainly since the rise of the internet, and this is something I say in the book that's coming out later this year, which in many ways addresses this kind of question. It's a book called The Secret Teachers of the Western World, which is kind of overview of the history of esotericism in the context of this kind of evolution of consciousness we were just talking about. This stuff isn't so esoteric anymore. I mean, it's just available. You know, if you go on the net, it's too available. You know, there's too much stuff. You know, there's just what we were saying earlier about this whole idea of every man his own critic. You know, there seems to be a glut of commentary out there. I don't know. In a way, I think maybe the age of these kind of flamboyant figures might be over. Not to say that people don't have dramatic lives. There might very well be others out there now. I mean, certainly in recent years, I know one of the people I write about in this book I just mentioned is this fellow named Valentin Tomberg, who's not alive. He died in the early 70s. But he wrote this remarkable book called Meditations on the Tarot, which is not a book on how to tell your fortune. It's this massive tome, and it was published anonymously after his death in a series of letters. And he takes each of the tarot trumps, and he just goes on this remarkable discursive kind of journey with the symbols involved and linking it up to a variety of different, ideas, and ranging from philosophy to the science of the time and psychology and other esoteric thinkers. And it's just, whatever you may think of his conclusions, the work is remarkable and should be read. And I mentioned it to say, like, esoteric work still goes on. You know, these kind of books are still produced. The Hermetic philosophy is still the Hermetic philosophy, and so on. But it's, again, I don't want to sound too nostalgic, but it's not, it's certainly not the way it was, say, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it's not the way it was when I think you and I, were becoming interested in this kind of stuff, where, yeah, you used to find it in an old, dusty bookshop somewhere, but now, as you say, you go on the net, and, everybody's been to Atlantis, and everybody's, telling you about their astral journey, and everyone's telling you about their shamanic weekend and everything, and it's kind of, sometimes I pull away and think, oh my God, I feel like becoming a materialist now. But that's just me. But I don't know. I suspect people are out there doing work, but I don't know if I don't know if it's the time of the kind of giants, let's say, as it was. I mean, to me, the most remarkable time, I would say, would have been the 20s into the 30s, because you had a lot of people working. Certainly, the first part of the 1920s, a lot of people working at the same time. You had Steiner, you had Annie Besant in the Theosophical Society, Krishnamurti, you had Gurdjieff, started his institute, for the harmonious development of man in Fontainebleau in France. You had Ouspensky, who had worked with Gurdjieff, and he had started his own groups in London around the same time. You had Jung starting up after he, was getting over his sort of breakup with Freud and gone through this kind of creative illness in which he produced, he discovered his psychology and produced the remarkable, red book of his that came out a few years ago. Crowley had his Abbey of Thelema in Sicily, and there were other people as well. So you had this incredible time to be very rich, and I call it sort of the golden age of modern esotericism. And I think kind of certainly post World War II, late 40s with the beginning of the kind of UFO kind of thing. This is really mass popularization of it, and certainly the book that kickstarts the 60s occult revival is The Morning of the Magicians. But I interviewed Anton Febvre, who was at the time held the chair in Western esotericism at the Sorbonne in Paris in sort of 1999, and he was saying that even by the 70s, names like Gurdjieff and Crowley and these others, they weren't mysterious anymore. People knew about them. So I don't know. Maybe it's as it should be. These ideas. One of the things I like to do is make this kind of barrier between the alternative and the mainstream. Kind of get that out of the way and say, look, these are just good ideas. Take from both sides, and we can learn from them, rather than say, oh well, I'm a materialist, or I'm a spiritualist, or I'm this, or I'm that, and kind of protecting your own little patch in your own little space.
Yeah, well, I think those barriers are breaking down anyway, and I think that, maybe if our industrial civilization eventually crumbles and the internet goes dark, maybe that'll coincide or overlap somehow with the final participation, and once again we'll see guys in capes and big brimmed hats with feathers in them, and there'll be myth and magic again, and
Let's hope so.
Well, Gary, today we've been talking about your book Revolutionaries of the Soul, Reflections on Magicians, Philosophers and Occultists. That's easily available everywhere. It's also worth mentioning that some of the characters we've been talking about, you've done standalone books on, so a lot to be getting into if people are interested. But tell folks about your website and anything else you'd like to share.
Well, you can, learn some more about myself and my work. It's Gary Lachman, myname.co.uk. And as Greg said, I've done, sort of introductory, sort of critical biographies of all the people we're talking about, more or less. You can find them on Amazon at all good bookstores.
Excellent. Well, Gary, thanks once again for joining us on legalizefreedom.com.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.